Hey friends, welcome back to another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. Everyone, I cannot believe I am saying these words. Welcome, Meghan Riordan Jarvis, to Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. Welcome to the show. Round of applause.
Oh my God. I can't believe it myself. I mean, hearing your voice, hearing you say my name when what I have done is listen to you interview like all my heroes. It is such an honor to be here.
Such an honor, my friend. I'm so happy you're here. For those of you who are watching clips or watching it on video, I'm holding up my copy of her exquisite memoir, End of the Hour, therapist memoir. I'm going to drop a link in the show notes. I'll be linking it in my socials. You know, it's coming out. What is the official? I have an advanced reader copy.
November 14th.
So by the time this hits the air, you're listening to this book is in bookshelves and bookstores near you. It's in all the places that you can buy books. I'm telling you, I read a lot of memoirs, a lot of books in this space, and I have never, ever read anything like this memoir.
You are
truly. No, truly. And we're going to explore today. I think it's, of course, it's a part because of your vulnerability, part because of your beautiful writing style, and part that you touch on the unpacking of what we call our personalities and their roots in our grief and in our trauma and in our childhood in ways that I've never seen another writer do. I've seen people do it sort of clinically, like this is how we understand attachment or this is how we understand trauma, but I've never seen a writer, experienced a writer do it through their own story.
Thank you.
And since I'm going to be honest with you all off air, since we're friends, all of us, also because there was so much resonant to my own ways in which trauma and grief have shaped me. I feel like I had a conversation with you, Meghan, the whole time I was reading the book. I was like, yes. And yeah, oh, I did that. And I was like talking, my dog thought I was talking to her, but I was talking to you as I was reading the book. And I think everyone who picks up this book is going to walk away learning something new about themselves, because we all have had some profound losses, some little T, big T traumas, but also learning something about how we show up, how we might aspire to show up for other people who are taken down, you know, by loss and grief. And that's what your book does.
Oh,
such a gift.
I'm being 100% in earnest when I say like, that means so much to me. You know, you never know when you're creating something, if it's going to land the way that you want it to land. And in grief and loss, really, it's like you're over here on your island feeling kind of isolated and alone. And it's like you're throwing out a rope to connect to the rest of the world. And then when someone says, oh, and then I felt that rope connect me to you, like that rope helped me. Yeah. That just means the world to me.
Oh, well, I'm glad it does. And I said it in earnest myself. I really, really believe it. I think it's such a profound gift to everybody who's going to pick up this book. I think we're going to learn so much. We share this passion, of course, about shifting our narratives of grief and being much more open and honest and vulnerable. We do that in sort of clinical ways, but also by sharing our own personal experiences and stories. And part of how I always like to do that, whether it's in the classroom or on this podcast, is to have us unpack sort of where our early grief beliefs came from. So wondering, since you're a listener to the show, you know the questions I'm asking. What's an early memory of loss and grief that comes to mind? And what do you think you learned subconsciously, consciously about what grief
You know, the memoir covers some things that are sort of like seminal events. But when you ask me that question, the first thing that I think about is my cat.
Yeah.
That when I was little, we had a cat. We grew up on a farm and we had a cat that's name was Kit Kat. That was basically, it was white and black, white and gray. And, you know, we lived on 16 acres of land, sort of, you know, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And so our animals were more like animals than they were pets. And Kit Kat got hit by a car. and got hit by a car, like by a woman who we really disliked. We made the Wicked Witch of the West noise when she came by. So it was like, it could not possibly have been worse.
Yes.
And what's relevant about it is my grandmother was there, and my mother's mother, whose name was also Mary. She was a school teacher, and she understood that the 6 grandchildren all needed individual attention. And so she scheduled like a 30-minute where you would go into her room, and she would do this thing that she called a tickle, where she'd like gently rub you the inside of your arm with her nails. And I have no idea what we talked about, but she was deeply, deeply Catholic. And my mother was deeply, deeply Catholic.
Yeah.
So my grandmother was there. My cat got hit by a car and died. And I think I said, I mean, I was beside myself because also the cat had been killed by the witch.
Yeah.
And I said, we'll get to see that cat in heaven. And my grandmother said, animals don't go to heaven. Like, just like that. Like, well, you know, animals don't go to heaven. And what I remember was like, you know, being startled, being terrified that there was no, she said a lot of other things after that. And I was like, there's no comfort around this. And what I remember about it was I never said anything about that cat again. I just was like, okay, I'm going to have to figure this out on my own.
Yeah.
This thing that they've been selling me all this time, this religion thing that they've been selling me for all this time, isn't going to work. And I have to be able to think of this cat as in some kind of better place that isn't permanently without me. I mean, I was really little.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, I have multiple sort of small stories of like searching and reaching for comfort.
Yeah.
And it just not being paired well, right? Like not attuned.
Yeah.
My grandmother was so loving. She wasn't trying to make me feel bad. She was literally trying to tell me what she believed was the doctrine of the Bible. Yeah. Animals are not going to be there.
And you need to know that more than you need comfort.
Yeah. And again, like my grandmother, I think was a different mother to my mother than she was a grandmother. I think she was much softer as a grandmother than she was ever able to be as a mother to my mother. But every once in a while, I would see the thing that my mom would describe about my grandmother being kind of like harsh and hard. And in this instance, I mean, I think about it all the time and I'm like, oh lady, did you have to say that? Like there were a lot of things you could have said in that moment.
Yeah. That not the most helpful one of the things you could have said. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And we probably will touch on some of the more seminal events too, but I appreciate you sharing that. As I've said this before, when guests have shared about pet loss, one of the many forms of loss I think we don't do enough, give enough attention to or validate, because we try to do that grief thieving thing where we try to compare, you know, the worthiness of some grief experiences. But especially for a child, a pet is there's an attachment and there's a reciprocity to, you know, that relationship that is so profound. And our grief is really around, you know, that powerful attachment being broken. And so I appreciate you sharing. Yeah. I mean, I told my dog things who also, you know, who passed young when I was young, things that I didn't tell my parents.
Yeah, sure.
You know, like, she was a Basset Beagle mix, so had long ears. So I would like lift up her ears and whisper things into her ears to tell her, you know, all my hard feelings and things that I was going through. So yeah, I think pet loss, and not just for kids, by the way. I was devastated a few years ago. Yeah. Pet loss can be profound whenever. So yeah, so I appreciate you saying that. And also just the ways in which the people who show up and, as I say stupid shit to us in our grief are rarely doing it out of malice.
No, never.
Mary was not doing that out of malice.
No, definitely not.
Often they do it because just out of attunement. Sometimes it's because they're trying to make themselves feel better in a way, you know, by saying it. But so it's important for us to unpack these kind of lessons or grief beliefs that we've learned, not in a way so that we can go back and come up with the litany of reasons our parents or grandparents screwed us over, but in this way so that we can be like, okay, do I want to believe that? Do I want to do something different? How do I show up?
That's right. That's exactly right.
which is why, by the way, our grandparents get to be different kinds of caregivers for us than they did to their parents, because they learn stuff over time,
Totally. That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
If my daughter decides to have children, I'm going to be definitely a better grandmother than I was a mother,
Yeah.
or am a mother. I am imagining, Yeah.
I think, I think your point is important, which is people are trying to show
Yeah.
up. And the thing that I talk about, it's in the memoir a little bit, is, being able to let people know when they're accidentally stepping on your foot and they think they're just
Yeah.
standing there. They don't know, right?
Yeah.
That they're harming you or hurting you. And I couldn't have done that as a little kid,
Of
but I
course
do
not.
do it as an adult now.
Yes. Yeah.
That when people, my dog Winston, who's a chocolate lab, he ate grapes the other day, which are toxic.
Yeah.
And my husband was in Italy and it was like 7:00. So I had to take him to the emergency room, and I text, because one of the things that I know to do as a person who lives with some PTSD is like, do not be in a hard moment alone, right?
Yeah.
Like, don't do it.
Yeah.
So I have, probably 5 people who kind of know, like, I may text you and there's nothing for you to do. I just need you to know that this is going on. And so I texted 3 different people, like, the stupid dog, ate and I'm terrified. And I really was terrified that, because he ate a lot of grapes and I just didn't know what was going to happen. And one of the people that I texted wrote back, like, I'm okay, I'll say some prayers. And I was like, prayers? That's not going to help me. Yeah. And then another person that I texted was like, call me. I can help you get there. I can find out, let me look up on the internet. And I was like, I don't need your executive functioning. Yeah. And then the third person said, like, that stupid fucking dog. And I was like, yep, that's it. That's what I needed. What I needed was just like, what a hassle. Yeah. Of course you're afraid, but also this is wildly inconvenient at dinner time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, that's part of what I've learned is, like, you don't need to fold inward when you feel alone. You can keep reaching outward. Yeah. You don't need to, it's hard to reach out and say to somebody, like, I need comfort right now. Yeah. And when they don't comfort you, that's just the first bid. Like, you don't have to accept it, but there are other ways. Yeah. And in that moment, I thought, wow, I'm doing this moment differently than I have in the past. And, even the people who said the other things, I was like, nah, that's not what I need you to say. Like, you're not the one.
Wrong.
I wasn't saying it to shame them. I was just sort of like, maybe that would have helped in a different moment. But right now I need to hear, like, Meghan, why did you even get a dog? Yeah. That's what I needed to hear.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I so appreciate that. There's a couple of things that you unpacked there you started to unpack there that I think dive beautifully into your memoir. But I want to also help people understand kind of who you are in the world, professionally and personally, before we kind of dive into your story. But, you said something there, and I think this is true of whether we're grieving or we're grieving with some level of PTSD or complex PTSD, which is, the importance of finding safe places to stay tethered to the world. Totally. And that reaching out thing, that the help isn't always about the help. Like, I'll drive you, I'll take you, I'll do the thing. That's right. The help is is being an anchor.
That's right.
Being a safe anchor or a tether in the world, because trauma or even just, intense emotions, profound, intense grief emotions can have us so untethered from ourselves and the world.
That's right. And that's really scary. And also, you can't always make great decisions in those moments. Like, you need to, just like a child needs to lean on the mind of an adult to have, because it doesn't have the intellect to imagine other things. When we're in trauma, we sometimes need to hear from other people who have better functioning minds than ours in that moment.
Right. Well, because our prefrontal cortex is like, bye.
See ya. Close down. This shop is no longer
business. Open. We are working with our monkey brain only. Thank you very much. Correct. Which doesn't always make great decisions. So I think folks who are not already following Meghan, who don't know about her amazing podcast, Grief is My Side Hustle. You might not know that you are a grief and trauma therapist, right? Is that how you would categorize yourself? And so here you are, somebody who has spent a career working with people in all forms of grief. Remind me what was your first kind of work setting? How did you start out in
Yeah.
that?
So I went straight into private practice after I
Okay.
got out of school. So I worked in an emergency room. I worked in a homeless clinic. But the minute I had enough hours to put out my own shingle, I went straight into private practice.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. So you've been working and with people who've experienced grief and trauma all these years. You've now put out this very personal memoir that shares, of course, some composite stories, but also your very deeply personal stories of grief and loss and trauma. Before we dive into sort of the stories, I'm wondering, as you sit here in this interview now with your book, previewing and ready to come on shelves, just any reflections you have about this turn of events, about this bravery, would you call it bravery, this gift that you're giving us, about being both the professional, having been on this side of the chair, but then also letting us inside to see that you've been on the other side too.
God, that's such a good question, Lisa. When I was sitting after I had sort of like written my heart out onto pages, which is how the book started. It was me writing letters to my mom. It was, a lot of the disrupted sleep. My central nervous system was dysregulated. I mean, it's still dysregulated. So I'd get up at 4:00 in the morning and, that's kind of like this liminal time. And I would have these words and I'd feel like I needed to write them down. And then it just sort of felt like, okay, now it's out of me, right? Like the energy is sort of out of me. And that was the process part. And then the product part was more like, I mean, honestly, I have said this a couple of times, kind of like a love letter to all the people that I have sat with in 20 years of work. I deliberately, when I was working with my first editor, pulled every story, every one of my personal vignettes that matched a story I'd heard from a client. Yeah. Like the story, there's a chapter in there where I get really angry at my husband, like irrationally angry. And I've heard that story from clients so many times that there's, I get really inappropriately hysterical in the funeral home. I've heard that story from clients so many times. So I really wanted people to feel the like circle, right? Like, I have read all the books. I have worked with the most complicated cases. It's a little bit like really being a scholar of France, knowing everything, the topography, all the languages that are spoken and all its history, and then going there for the first time and being like, oh my God, the salted butter on the bread. Like I had no idea. Yeah. The five senses experience of being traumatized by grief was such I don't exactly mean this, but it was such a gift to my deeper understanding of like both what we do and don't do well. And also what I have come out sort of saying, which is I think every conversation we're ever having is kind of about grief and about love, actually. Yep. So I think when I look at it, like when I was in treatment, one of the clinicians said to me, like, you could look at this, the fact that you had to check yourself into an inpatient facility, as a declaration of profound love for your mother. And I was like, no, that's not what this is. Like my mother would not have wanted to be loved this way. I would not want it. And she would not be at all okay with where I am right now. And when I say that, I mean like she'd be mad, not like, oh, I'm so sorry for you. She'd be like, pick yourself up and pull yourself together. But I do really feel both incredibly proud of checking myself into a facility and talking about that I have no shame about that I actually have incredible amount of pride that I took care of myself, and that ultimately really I had to make that decision for myself. Nobody was better equipped to make that decision for me than me, both academically, but also just process wise. I knew what I needed to do. And I really deeply understand that there is a difference between grief that makes you sick and grief that is hard to bear. And so I really wanted people to see my experience with my dad's death, which was manageable. It was sad.
Grief that's hard to bear.
Yeah. It was hard to bear. It was sad. It was difficult. But with the resources around me, just regular therapy, my friends, my family, I had nightmares after my dad died. I didn't eat, but it all abated.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to juxtapose that, because the part that is hard is that when people feel criticized, when they're like, everybody's waiting for me to go back to normal, it's because there is no standard amount of knowledge about what someone is supposed to be doing, and what is healthy grieving, and how long it does take, and what it should look like.
Yeah.
So, and the interesting thing is, no one around me knew that I was traumatized, except really my husband and my best friend. Yeah. My best friend was like, "You don't smell right. Something's wrong." Yeah. And I was mad about that. I was like, "Leave me the frick alone. I'm doing the best I can." But everybody else was sort of like, "Yeah, you have clothes on. You took a shower. You must be doing okay." And I was not doing okay. Yeah. And I think the fact that people do not know the difference, right? Like when you think about addiction, it's not difficult to go to a party and be like, "I think that person might have trouble with alcohol," just like based on what I'm seeing. Yeah. That doesn't look like the average relationship with alcohol. But we don't have a threshold around grief and loss. Yeah. And people say things like, "Well, they're really depressed." I had a friend say that to me, like, "You're depression." I was like, "I'm not depressed.
I'm grieving."
Yeah. She was like, "Well, all the symptoms." And I was like, I will not accept that. I am not depressed. Like, I understand that there's some crossover, but depression comes from nowhere. These symptoms that you're seeing come from loss. Yeah. Yeah. So I really wanted people to feel like they had just like a little bit of a better handle on what does the difference look like? When do we need treatment? Why might we need treatment? Like, why? Yeah. And I've written a clinical book, so it's almost like a partner to the memoir. The memoir is my personal experience of all the things. And then in the clinical book, it's just like all the anecdotal examples of all the things.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I so appreciate you saying that. And also your sort of revealing that writing this memoir and being so boldly honest and vulnerable and showing all the good, the bad, the ugly of what it means to walk through, sort of traditional grief or grief, and then grief that is traumatizing, that grief opens up, past traumas, and the willingness that you had to recognize, and the capacity you had, frankly, to recognize, I need something more than outpatient therapy. I need to go inpatient. Even when you're a therapist who's placed people in facilities like this before, I think is such and to do all of that, your reflection, I guess, is what I was going to say, that to do all of that and not feel the sense of shame, but to feel sort of pride, both in your own capacity to show up for yourself in that way, but also, to me as the reader, you're gifting us in the world this example of actually getting help and going through healing is something that we want to celebrate more. We like to celebrate the shiny end thing.
Yeah.
Like, and they're better now, and they're a success now, and they're
the Oprah fat pants. That's what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. The Oprah fat pants kind of scenario. But what you did in this memoir was, show really all the muck, that happens to us. And I want to dive into sort of the embodiment of trauma in terms of sickness and the decision to go through. But for those who haven't read your memoir yet, just to help us understand sort of like these pivotal moments that looked like, I'm thinking about the accident that happened to the young girl when you were young, and, your father's death and, your mother's death, like, just help us kind of orient to what led up to this culmination of a therapist checking herself into an inpatient trauma treatment center.
Yeah. So, the book sort of follows an arc of that is like timeline wise. So I start with me as a child, and I talk about this, horrific event that happened in my very small town where I spend my summers, where my parents ultimately moved to on Cape Cod. There was a drowning. So my family was on the beach, and this teenager who was beloved by, everyone, was my sailing instructor, went in the water and didn't come out. And my older brother found the body in the water, and my mother watched that, the rescuers and everything remove the body from the water, and it lived inside my family in silence. And so like it just lived there. It was like breathing in the corner, like heavy breathing. And my mother had PTSD from what she saw, which we didn't really talk about until much later, but I knew what she was experiencing. She really she had images that she could not shake.
Yeah.
But we didn't, as a family, end up having to talk about it because it happened in a summer community. And then we went back to our regular scheduled fall, and nobody there knew what happened. And so it was so confusing to me to have something be like the worst thing that had ever happened to anyone. And I was very good friends, and still am, actually. My best friend, Maya, who's in the book, it was, I had to sort of strip it back, but Maya, who has been my best friend since I was 11, was the person who died's cousin. It was very confusing to me how it could be so important and also not important to talk about. Yeah. Like we're never going to talk about it. And what then happens, which doesn't really work in the timeline, but by the time I was a young adult and I was going through kind of my first real heartbreak, I was really aware that other people seemed to bounce back from stuff much faster than I did. Yeah. Or that it didn't land in their system or on their heart in a way that made them believe something bad about themselves. And so I walked around in my life for my whole life feeling like the negative exception to a rule. And always trying to, all I wanted to do was like be in the middle of the crowd wearing the right clothes and seem normal. And when I walked into my first therapist office, she started asking me questions. And then she said to me, you know, many, many people who have unresolved trauma from their childhood feel the way you feel. And I was like, wait, what? Yeah. I thought like I was just the bad example of a human. And then she introduced me to some of those people. I did group therapy with them. And it was just this like, oh, you know, kind of the title to Oprah's book, like, this isn't about who I am. This is about what happened. Yeah. So there's this seminal childhood event that just sort of defines all the anxiety in my life. Yeah.
I want to pause for a minute and repeat what you just said. This isn't about who I am. This is about what happened. Yeah. And I think for many of us who are unpacking years later, trauma, unresolved trauma, whether it's attachment wounds or, you know, emotional wounds or event trauma, I think that's such an important thing for us to recognize. Yeah. Yeah. The challenge is it becomes in a way who we are because it shapes how we operate in the world.
That's right.
So then it's even trickier to pull apart the innateness of who we are versus like what the trauma response was in our body. Anyways, I just wanted to pause there because I think I know for sure that so many of my listeners are either have already been through working on their trauma or just starting to unpack that. And that kind of not fitting in, that kind of anxiety that you're starting to talk about is so common for those of us.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, that literally, I remember her saying like, well, your behavior is a hallmark of someone with unresolved childhood trauma. Yeah. And me being like, wait, what? Like, you know, like somebody saying like, you have an underlying infection. That's why your hair is like it is. And you're like, wait, what? Like, and there's a medicine for that? Like, I didn't know. Yeah. And so then this therapist, you know, I'd be like, well, and then I did this, or like, I remember saying one time, like, oh, something's going on at home, so I'm going to go home for the weekend. Yeah. And she was like, wait, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Why are you going home for the weekend? And I was like, well, because there's problems at home, whatever, like somebody needs help with something. And she was like, do you want to go home? And I was like, I don't know. I don't even know
what
how to
kind of question is that?
You just go home when this is happening. And she was like, or you could not go home. And I remember like being like, lady, what is wrong with you? I have to.
Those aren't the rules that operate in my head. Yeah.
So really it was like, I mean, I remember her saying one time, like, there's a lot of rules inside this country club that you used to belong to, that you are still espousing and living by. And like, if you're going to do that, you might as well just live in the country club. If you're not, you should probably build your own country club with its own rules. And it was just, I know, right? So she was an extraordinary therapist who seemed to believe so many of the good things about myself that I wanted to believe, that I hoped were true. Yeah. And so she just had me taking a lot of risk. And I, again, one of the hallmarks of childhood trauma is that you don't take a lot of risk, because why in the world would you?
Yeah.
Because, why would you add the possibility of something bad happening when you can just live with like the milquetoast medium of whatever it is that you're doing right now? So that sort of sets up my young adult life. And a lot of what you see in the memoir is me, going and building a life that I believe is filled with all the things that I want. And then my dad was diagnosed with small cell cancer, which is lethal.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting thing inside my family because there's a lot of us.
Yeah. You have 5 siblings, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my dad did not have a great relationship with every one of them. And that was something, honestly, he had earned.
Yeah.
And so there wasn't like a party line, like, oh, we're all Democrats and this is what the leader of the Democrats say. Like there wasn't. And so I really had to sit down with my husband and say, like, how do I want to show up for this? And it was like the easiest part of our relationship. He was dying and I just wanted him to know I loved him. And so I did that by showing up, by going.
Yeah.
And I asked my family to hold that. Is it okay if I'm away for the weekend? So what's interesting, and there's an undercurrent of it in the memoir, but it really began the shift sort of in my marriage where like I had been kind of the primary parent. My husband did a lot of traveling. When my dad was dying, he just kind of pulled back on some of that and did more of the like weekend soccer stuff.
Yeah.
And then my dad died, which was very sad and hard. And I think devastating for my mom. I think she didn't, they had been married 50 years and I can't imagine how you are supposed to reinvent yourself. And then my mom and I took a trip together. It was the first trip she took after my dad died. Well, she had been out to see a granddaughter graduate in Seattle and she had a stomach bug. And, this is some of my favorite writing in the book because it's the last time I spent with my mom where she was really alive.
Yeah.
But she was not well. And our conversations that we had, there's a scene that's not in the book where like we're driving somewhere and I start asking her about distant relatives. And even as I'm asking her about distant relatives, I'm like, why am I asking her these questions? So I do think energetically, both she and I knew something was amok or not quite right. And then I came back we were in Maine for that trip and I came back and she came back and then I went to her house with my kids as I do every summer. And 10 days into that trip, she died in her sleep. And it was from the moment, it's a pretty powerful part of the book, her death, because again, there's a lot of energy in the system. There's a lot of, my son seemed to know that something was wrong. I certainly knew that something was wrong. But there's a lot of energy also because there's a moment where I'm with the kids. I've just learned my mom died, which I knew, but my husband sort of says it to me. And there's this like still point moment where I understand that I'm not okay, that I need help. Ruminations come and I immediately I'm like, oh, it's my fault she died. I didn't take good enough care of her.
Yeah.
And I have to decide, am I going to like let people come and help me in this moment, or this minivan full of kids, am I going to make sure they get driven where they need to go? And that's the choice I make. The choice I make in that moment is to take care of them. And that really is the root of how I start to get sick, is that I immediately chose not to be present for myself and my own experience and my own devastation.
Yeah.
And instead sort of put on the apron of like, I'm going to tidy up for everybody else. And by the time I took it off, because there was nothing else to tidy up, I was totally lost. I just had no idea who I was or what the world was or what I was even doing there. Yeah. And I write about that because one, because it happened, two, because I have worked with so many people where that was their experience with loss, is they lost their compass. They lost their understanding of how to move forward. And it's recidivism it is me now as the adult sort of perpetrating the silence and not showing up emotionally for what I know I need, which is comfort and care in those moments.
You needed someone to tell you, to hold you and let you know you're going to be safe, and to
and even, I mean, I write about it a lot. Even when people tried to do that, I would not let them. I would not let them. I just could not be comforted. I could not be soothed. I really wanted people to like just leave me on the side of the road. To just let me be by myself, to either survive or die. But I did not, I couldn't see a world in which the people around me weren't going to be anything but pulled down by me.
Just taking a moment, because this just resonates so deeply for me. I think I can imagine for so many listeners, but I'm thinking of a way to ask this question, or just as the invitation, which is, do you feel that that version of you, that Meghan, couldn't imagine a world that somebody was capable of comforting her in the wake of now being, an orphan? Because little Meghan never experienced comfort in that way.
You guys will, if you read the book, you will be introduced to my husband, who is my favorite person in the world. We've been married 20 years. I'm like not even a little bit sick of him. I don't actually think that's it. Okay, like, I think I knew as an adult, I mean, my husband would do anything, for me. My best friend would do anything for me. And this isn't the first time that either of them have had to my sister. I think it was, honestly, if I don't sweep the floor, then I'm going to have to sit here and feel what's going on. If I don't actively move to support other people and do things, then what I will be faced with is a life I have no idea how to live.
And that feels like too much.
It's just impossible. I mean, every single, even now when I'm like, I have lived 4.5 years without my mother. I say that out loud and I'm like, how is that possible? Like, I don't even understand how I've lived one day without her. Like, how is that possible? Oh, that makes me emotional.
Oh yeah.
But I think in that moment, it was my form of running, right? Like fight, flight, freeze. I was fleeing the scene of, you can't fight against death. I mean, maybe you can. I know that people yell and they kick and they scream. But really, I just was
running,
trying to not have to do what ultimately everyone has to do, which is figure out a way to live in this world without that person. And, I think when I say that, people are like, that's because you loved your mother so much. And here's the thing. I loved my mother so much. But also we were pains in the ass to each other. And one of the things that I try to write about it is she just had a lot of influence on how I lived my life. Pleasing her and wanting her to be proud of me was important to me, even though I didn't want it to be important to me. So I have this moment, I can't remember if it's in this book or in a different piece of writing, where I'm like looking around my house and I'm like, do I like this paint? Or do I like this stuff? Did I buy this? Did I paint this house and do that wallpaper for me, or because I thought my mom would like it? And so there is this thread, which again is trauma related, which is really about codependency, right? And codependency, not in a like, oh, I'm enabling you to drink, which is how I think a lot of people think about it. Codependency in the way that I keep myself safe is focusing on other people's needs rather than my own. And so when people say to me, I mean, this still happens to me. My kids will be like, Mom, where do you want to order? And like, what do you want to eat, Mom? What do you want to eat? And I don't answer that question. I think, well, what restaurant's really busy? Who else is going to be in the house and what do they eat? I don't answer the question of like, I would like Chinese food.
Yeah.
I more do all the math of what is possible.
Yeah. And what would
And
please
that's
other people.
codependency.
Yeah.
Yeah. People pleasing, but codependency is like almost people pleasing on steroids. Codependency is everything about my wagon is impacted by how your wagon is riding.
Yeah.
Because they're tethered together. People pleasing is a little bit like, I just want you to be happy and then you'll go to your house and I'll go to my house.
Yeah.
Codependency is we are going back to the same house, whether it's, figurative or literal.
Yeah.
How you live and how I live are intertwined.
Yeah.
And, I do think both because my mom had a lot of kids, she mostly raised us by herself, and because I was really aware of how impacted she was by that death. And I just wasn't sure that our family was going to be okay. I was like, great, I'll take on the job of being, a second mom. And I'm really careful in the book not to talk from my siblings' experiences or about their experiences. In fact, I don't even use their names. But I do want to say, like, I am not trying to say that is unique to me. There are other people in the family who also took on roles as helpers, also felt exactly as I felt.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you helping us understand that the profound unearthing or, disorientation that you felt of your mother's loss wasn't just because of the profound love. Because I think we get confused when we think about the intense emotions we often feel when we lose somebody who we are disconnected from or estranged from, or we have a complicated relationship with, because so many things about how we've operated in the world, how we show up in the world, as you said, whose wagon we've hitched ourselves to, even if it's not a pleasant experience, even if it's not a pleasant relationship.
That's right.
That gets lost when that person dies too, which means when they say a part of you dies.
Yeah, it's real.
A part of you dies. And then what an existential crisis to be faced with. And then how do I operate in this world? How do I imagine a world, without them? And so, that survival instinct of like, I'm just going to be the survivor, keep busy doing.
Yeah. And then
makes a lot of sense. Yes. And like, thank you system for helping me survive. And wow, now we've crashed into the wall. And talk about that, because you talk about, you move from like, I'm just going to get these kids in the minivan, like literally the moment you got the notice, to a safe place, but you just kept going.
Yeah.
And our emotions and our trauma will find us. Yeah. And tell us a little bit about what happened in the physicality, the sickness.
I do. I want to say that part of the writing right after my mom dies, and we have her funeral. I'm functioning. I'm angry. I'm frustrated, and then we're leaving. We're leaving her house, and we're leaving the town, and we're leaving the space. And what I will say is, I knew that was not going to be okay for me. And I think that's important. Like, I knew instinctively that if I left when I left, I was not going to be okay. And I
didn't
had
listen
to
to that. Yeah.
Well, there was no option to stay.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I think that's important because I work with people who like, they have to sell their mother's house.
Yeah.
And so they have to donate all the things. And they know as they're doing it that it is not okay.
Yeah.
And that they're going to regret it and that it's going to be a problem. And that's real. Part of how we end up having to navigate grief is outside of our, control, and therefore what our central nervous system can handle.
Yeah.
But that piece of writing is some of the writing I'm the most proud of, because when I went to write the book, I couldn't even remember what happened. I couldn't remember driving home, because there's a lot of, cognitive problems when your body is trying to protect you from being overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And I talked to, on my podcast, I talked to Dr. Lisa Schulman, who's she's a neuroscientist, and she said, keep writing. The memories are there. You live that life. They will come. And that's exactly what happened. One day I woke up and it was like my system was safe to go back to my experience with it was like, oh my God, I was so unwell. And so it was really hard. The compassionate adult in me, it was really hard to write how all the adrenaline fell out of my body, how wasn't able to like physically hold my torso up, that, I was panicking. I was having these unbelievable panic attacks. I mean, that it's hard to remember. It's pretty traumatizing to remember. And that is a thing that I have seen with people, right? Yeah. So my clients often come in, with a similar story, that they don't know why they couldn't get out of bed for 18 days or take a shower.
Yeah.
And they'll say things like, oh, it was depression. And it's not depression. Depression is a different thing diagnostically. This is your body's symptomatic response to a traumatic loss.
Yeah.
And I just, I wrote about it again, sort of as a love letter to my people, so that they will understand that we grieve with our bodies, our human bodies. Yeah. And it doesn't matter if you have 2 master's degrees and like another $100,000 worth of training.
Yeah.
You are still, going to go through the grief process, and it's going to have that impact on your body. And I, again, my mother's death was traumatic. And so all the little very well-informed self-care things that can be helpful and can be supportive when you're kind of at a 5 or a 6 did not at all work, because I was at a 9.
Yeah.
So I'm swimming and I'm walking and I'm trying to eat and I'm, trying to do a little bit of therapy, and like, I'm just getting sicker and worse and worse. And ultimately what happens is I become completely immobilized. I throw my back out so significantly that I'm on the floor in the basement
for days. I remember, right?
For days. And I can't even get up and use the bathroom. I mean, I'm just completely, and it's at that point, it's at the point when I hear my daughter say to a friend who has stopped by.
Yeah. Oh, this passage.
Right. And it was such an important moment, because I am very aware from my own therapy how often I was trying to help my mom as a child, even though you can't help an adult really when you're 10.
Yeah.
But my daughter, the doorbell rang. I was downstairs. I was kind of like doped out on painkillers. And her friend's like, hey, you want to come out and play? It's just about to be the beginning of the school year, or the school had just started. And she pauses and says like, my mom might need me, so I think I should stay here. And I burst into tears and was like, nope, no way. Absolutely no way.
And not repeating.
And, we talked a minute ago about like, I don't have any shame about checking myself into the facility, which is totally true. It's it may be the thing I'm the most proud of in my life, but I had a lot of shame in those moments about how I could, even now when I talk to clients or podcast guests and they're like, look, it wasn't an option for me to not function because I had kids.
Yeah.
I do kind of fold in on myself, and I'm like, well, it wasn't really an option for me because I have 3 kids too, but I couldn't stop it.
Yeah.
I couldn't like will myself to function. Yeah. My body would not have it. And I was totally immobilized. Yeah. So there was, in those moments, in my worst, on the basement floor moment, I did have a lot of self-loathing and a lot of shame about just what a big hit I had taken, even though I was a clinician and even though I had all this therapy under my belt.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's such a challenge. I mean, I still think about that all the time. I was a clinical director of a big nonprofit when my husband died, and I still didn't know what the hell I was doing. I would say to that version of Meghan, and to all the listeners who've maybe didn't get to the point of throwing their back out and becoming immobile, but who felt, is that how we're functioning in the wake of loss is a real big spectrum.
Yeah.
Like, I was showing up and taking my daughter to school. Right. Was I even present in my own body? Was I attending? Right. Like, there are ways in which I look back at my own parenting and early grief and definitely feel a lot of regret. I thought I was functioning.
Well, what's interesting,
like I thought I was like, I had it together. And when I look back, I'm like, oh no, man.
What's interesting now is, I use a lot of parts work, IFS, Dick Schwartz work. And what's interesting now is I think my body knew me well enough to know that I was not going to stop.
Yeah. It was like, you need to pay attention.
And it was like, oh no, sweetheart. Oh no, I am going to take you down. Like I rang the bell and then I knocked on the door and then I went around the back.
Yeah.
And now I'm breaking in the house.
Yeah.
So now the way that I feel about the fact that I became so physically immobilized is like grateful. Yeah. The same way that I have this huge fight with my best friend, which actually was the part of the book that I was the most worried about when I was out to people reading. I really wanted to make sure that she didn't feel hurt by that chapter. And it turned out to be very much the opposite. It actually sort of like resolved some things that we hadn't maybe been totally able to resolve in getting the friendship sort of back on track. But I had this really big fight with my best friend because she insisted on seeing what I did not want to be seen.
Yeah.
She insisted, even though I was like, stop it. I am okay. She was like, the hell you are. And I feel like she was saying that to me. And my body was like, you are not going up those stairs. No.
Yeah.
And I sort of feel about my body the way I do about my best friend. Like, that's a tough way to be loved.
Yes.
But it's important.
So important. So important. So here you are at this crossroads. You've built this career as a grief therapist, as trauma therapist, and you've experienced a traumatic response to this profound loss.
Yeah.
And you recognize, because as you said, first the knocking and then the ringing and then around the door, your body was like, enough. You knew about this Foundations, I think it's called in Tennessee, this trauma inpatient treatment. You kind of go through and share in your story. There's a lot of course, it's financially ridiculously expensive. And you have all these conversations with Mike, and your husband, Mike, who turned out to have borrowed some money, but said, I got it, we're covered. And there you walk into this trauma treatment center, a place where you've sent many of your, maybe not that specific place, but you've.
No, that was it. I only use one place.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the place.
And when I want folks to read the book, so we won't give away so we won't spill all the tea here, but when you think about your time there, which was 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
3 weeks.
Yeah. Which is very short.
Which is short, right? Yeah. When you think about your time there, are there some pivotal moments? I mean, there's so many things. I wish I wanted to read so many books, but I don't remember if this wisdom came from there or somewhere else, but this is not a problem. This is just different. Yeah. That expression really was, I underlined and sticky noted and tabbed that one for sure as a gift to myself. But when you think about your time there, was there?
I think, so there's a scene, which I'll let people read, but there's a scene where like, I think I'm doing great. Yeah. I'm attacking a task, everything. And, everything about living inside a trauma facility, everything is therapeutic. There's not 1 minute where there isn't.
Even driving from the airport.
Exactly.
Is therapeutic.
The whole thing, even a trip to Target. And so I think, I'm doing better. Here I am. I'm functioning. I'm getting something done. Yeah. And one of the clinicians turns to me and says, hey, so are you working on codependency? Because I had really significantly overfunctioned during a group event.
Yes.
And what I think I didn't ever fully catch in my early treatment, in my early therapy, was really what codependency meant.
Yeah.
And the function that it served. It's not just because other people around you aren't functioning well. Yeah. It's then you just get to be watercolor. You don't have to come out as for or against anything. Yeah. You don't have to plant a stake anywhere because you are the whole time just with all your hypervigilance sort of ebbing and flowing and dodging and ticking and whatever. And so no wonder I didn't know who to be after my mother died, because I really wasn't my whole self while my parents were alive. I was inside a system, whether they wanted this or not, right? They didn't write it down. They didn't say, Meghan, this is what we would like you to do. This is how I adapted to the stress of my system. And I would have told you, I have worked on this. I have solved these problems and they are gone. Yeah. And it meant, and again, I don't write so much about this in the book, but when I came back from treatment, it was a complete overhaul inside my family of like, guys, you know what?
I can't
I
operate in this way anymore.
It's not even that I can't, it's that I don't want to.
Yeah.
I never wanted to do this stuff. Like it continues to be an argument or a conversation inside my family. But one of the things that made me the most angry when I came back was making dinner. First of all, I'm not a good cook. Yeah. I don't really want an extra job at the end of the day after I've worked for a really long time. But also, why should everyone in the house get food cooked for them but me? Yeah. Why do I have to make my own food and everybody else's food?
Yeah.
I understand that like for some other people, they love to cook, they whatever.
Yeah.
But to me, that felt like we have to renegotiate this. I never wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't have to do it every day.
Yeah.
So that was a big change. And there is a conversation that we have inside our family about what do we have to do and what do we want to do?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that you have to know, are they in alignment? Doesn't mean you're not going to have to do some things, right? That's life.
Yeah.
But what do you have to do versus what you want to do? And my husband has this phrase. I mean, he brought it into our relationship very early, which is, what do you want the weekend to look like? What would make a good weekend for you? Yeah. And I just love that question because it's like, well, I'd like to sleep in and also I have to get the taxes done.
Yeah.
It leaves room for both.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so beautiful. Yeah. I so appreciated the way that you brought this awareness around codependency in this different way than we've traditionally think, including in my family, because, you know, addiction has been in my family's past. And so I always think about codependency as that sort of Al-Anoni and addiction related.
Yeah, exactly.
It is. And I think this notion that part of what can be so traumatic for us when we lose certain profound figures in our lives is if we've developed this sense of self so deeply entrenched and codependent and wagons hitched, as you said, to somebody else, it's a real unraveling. And this time at the treatment center, you might have passed through that whole time at the treatment center if this person hadn't really called you on that. I mean, it doesn't sound like it because it sounds like they know what they're doing, but you'd been through many therapies before, and that really was the thing that helped you start to see this opportunity for you to get to know who actually am I?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That word opportunity seems really extraordinary, right? Like when I look back at the devastating events, also what I see is like, oh, you know, it's like that quote, you know, when the barn burns down, you can finally see the moon. Yeah. I don't know where I'd be now if I hadn't gone to treatment. So again, you know, I write really lovingly about that facility and the care that I got there. Because I really just can't imagine what would have happened if I hadn't been given the time to get my central nervous system back online so that I could function, but also the opportunity to be really intentionally reflective about like, whose life do you want to live? Yeah. Yes. I don't know how people, I just don't think that we have that there are enough quiet moments. No. And when you're really at odds, when you can't keep doing what you were doing, you're much more open-minded to
some new way, some new path.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's exactly right.
You know, there's a passage in the book I did want to read because I think I kept thinking about for all of us to, you know, we have this saying, everybody's grief journey is unique and only you can, you know, walk your grief. I think we like that in some ways. I always push back against that a little because I think it adds on to this sort of individualistic, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing.
I agree.
And, you know, you said something in the book around sort of differentiating, like, yes, I have to grieve, but I don't have to do it alone, which I think is really different. And I'd love, if it's okay, I'd love to read this
I would
passage. It's starred in sticky note and underlined. It's a bit of a long one, but listeners, you're in for a treat. Meghan wrote, in past therapy, I'd learned to grieve. With my hand still on Dagger's face, I now contemplated my thoughts about being unsupported in childhood. Couldn't my parents have helped me? Wouldn't they have at least tried? What if my long-term childhood trauma was more about never learning how to ask for help and less on account of it not being available? Ooh, this is making me tear up. I heard my own voice repeating a therapist's favorite, feelings are not facts. I'd felt helpless and alone in grief as a child. I felt helpless and alone in grief as an adult. No one is coming to save me but me. But I was coming to understand that didn't mean it had to be me alone. The light in my chest remained. The way down the hill was easier than the way up.
I know, it makes me teary to have you read it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this notion that it's what's never learning about how to ask for help unless on account of it not being available. I think so many of us carry these stories about the times that people weren't there for us.
Yeah.
And part of holding that story feels like there's some power because we're holding people to account, and I'm not here to talk about forgiveness or that's to each their own. But the powerful thing to me about the lesson that you learned in that treatment, which is, I think, a lesson for all of us to learn. I'm actually learning it again in this season of my life as I navigate cancer, is about learning it's about the learning to ask for help. And you modeled that so beautifully in your life for your children, for your husband, for your friends. And you modeled it so beautifully for us in this memoir. And I just couldn't be more grateful to you for the memoir, for the conversation, for the friendship. Thank you for gifting this to us. It feels, I'm sure, like a gift to yourself, but it's really a gift to all of us. Truly, truly.
That is really meaningful to me. And it is really overwhelming to hear someone else read what I wrote back to me. But I think the part that feels overwhelming right now is that even if I didn't know your grief story, I can feel it.
Yeah.
Right. And so the thing about not having to be alone, because I actually do think everyone is alone in their loss.
Of course.
You lost your husband in a way that no one else did. Yeah. That is yours alone.
Yeah.
And there's some neuroscience behind this, which always helps me. Actually, Fred Rogers telling us to look for helpers. That is the most instinctive response that we have as humans, is to collectively show up for each other. Yeah. Which actually, one of the things that I have always known about myself is that I feel safer, even crying in a public place, than if I'm by myself. Yeah. And I ask that question to my clients, are you a shower crier, or would you cry over dinner with a friend? Yeah. And people are always like, it's an interesting question. But I don't need somebody else to rescue me. Yeah. I just need to know that I'm not on the outside of humanity looking in, falling off a cliff. Yeah. And so just someone being there and saying, this makes sense, or I see you. Yeah.
I mean, this is really this notion of holding space. We need someone to hold space. And grief has become such an individual act in modernity. And it's not meant to be.
No,
it's not. Wrong. It's not meant to not be witnessed. Yeah,
that's right.
My sign off for the show is, I see you, I hear you, and I'm holding you in my heart. And that really came from my own. I mean, I do this work because I wasn't seen and I wasn't held, and someone wasn't holding me in their heart. And I recognized throughout my own healing that that's really at the core of what we all need. Yes, sometimes we need practical help in the things, but mostly, primarily, we need to be on the inside of humanity, as you said.
Right, because the reality is, whatever it is that you create for yourself in your own grief experience that helps you is unique and specific to you. Yeah. And then I may have to go, you may run to help you with your grief, and I may sing to help me with my grief. But it is actually a natural process that we all go through. It's like aging. It's like a developmental thing that's going to be part of our lives and part of our bodies and part of our history. And really what we want to do is say, that is hard, and I see it, and I believe you're going to do it. Yeah. For one of the things that I always used sort of, it felt to me the most powerful were these statistics about like, look, 97% of people get through grief and loss.
Yeah.
Physically.
Yeah.
Like they get through it. Like there's 3% out there that, don't survive within the first 2 years, which is real.
Yeah.
But 97% of people survive it.
Yeah.
And that's a really amazing survival rate. And I think even though it doesn't feel like you have any idea how to get through it, if we just say, can you live through the next 3 hours?
Yeah.
And I'll just sit here.
Yeah.
Or I'll call you, or I'll check in, or I'll just send you, one of the things I say to clients a lot is at some point today, something is going to sparkle at you. And I just want you to know that's me. I am sending that to you.
Yeah.
And that's the universe is showing up for me to do that. So at some point today, something's going to flicker at you. And then they'll text me and be like, it did. And I'm like, I know.
I'm going to borrow that expression, if you don't mind. I love that.
Absolutely.
Something's going to sparkle at you. Yeah, I love that. Yeah. I'm just revisiting Francis Weller's Apprenticeship of Sorrow course and just re-listening to it again. And, he has this expression, we're wildly entangled.
That's right. And we should be in grief.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we should be. And we've gotten
so far afield from that.
We're just, your company says like you get 3 days off. Like what?
Yeah.
The messages that we get about it, which is like, it's a problem that you're having that experience and please recover from it as quickly as possible.
Don't get your grief on me.
Right. Instead of like when you have a baby, people are like, you're a mom now.
Yeah.
You're never not going to be a mom.
Yeah.
For the rest of your life, you're going to carry this responsibility, and this grieving is the same.
Yeah.
It's just the same.
Oh, that's profound. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and maybe we like babies more because babies are cute. But imagine if what we said was, you're going to, some part of you is going to do the job of grieving for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And how can we, as your employer or your friend or your cousin, I mean, one of the easiest things, my phone is just filled with people's anniversaries.
Oh, mine too. Mine too.
Right? That's it. Like, and I did it to my friend, the writer, Matt Bays, the other day. I just said, like, I know today is the day.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about you and your sister, and I love you so much. And he was like, you have no idea what that meant to me. I'm like, I know exactly what it meant to you.
Yeah, because when people...
I know exactly what it meant to you.
Same. Our dear friend, our mutual friend, Melissa Gold, it was just hers. And I sent it to her, and she said,
that's right.
I didn't know you knew. And I said, yeah. Those simple acts. But again, that's all about... Those acts aren't about doing something or assuming you have a problem or fixing you. Those acts are coming up just alongside you and bearing witness.
I see this part of your life.
Yeah, I see you. And I know this to be true because I've been here too. Yeah. Exactly.
It's not that hard. You just put it in your calendar.
Exactly.
Right?
Meghan, I feel like I know for certain this is the beginning of many conversations.
I mean, you and I actually have plans to see each other.
I know,
soon,
y'all.
so
don't be
jelly.
jelly.
Say that. We shouldn't brag.
But we're going to be in person together.
Don't
be too jelly, anyone. Anyways, but in the meantime, by the time you're hearing this, we will actually have seen each other, and her book will be in bookstores everywhere. End of the Hour, a therapist memoir, Meghan Riordan Jarvis. Show notes. The link is in the show notes. It's on my socials. Do yourself a favor. Pick up this book. Wrap yourself in a warm blanket, a cup of coffee, and just be with it because it's going to change your life in just the most beautiful way. So, Meghan, thank you so much for joining me on Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. Thank you.
Loved it. I can't believe I just did this show with you. Thank you so much. You are such a gift to everyone out there.
Such a treat. Thank you, Meghan. Bye, everyone. See you next time. Thanks for watching another episode of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Keefauver. And don't forget, if you love the show, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment. Share something that you learned from our conversation today.